From Deloitte Tax, welcome to the Tax News and Views podcast. In this series, we talk to specialists from Deloitte about the latest business issues and developments. I'm Carrie Falkenhayn, your host for Tax News and Views, and today we're recording a special tax policy edition to provide an update on the current budget resolution process. We're recording this on April 6, 2025, following a week of developments that I'm sure our audience will be interested in. Joining me are my frequent guests on tax policy topics, Anna Taylor and John Traub from Deloitte's Tax Policy Group. So, to get us started, the Senate Saturday morning gave its approval to an amended budget resolution that is designed to open the door to a budget reconciliation. Anna, what's different about that and what do we need to know about it?
Yeah, so this came after a marathon grueling vote-a-rama process in the Senate over the last couple of days. On Saturday morning, they were able to pass their budget resolution to unlock the budget reconciliation process. The vote-a-rama process is not one that's enjoyable for anybody in the Senate, majority, minority, but they always go through it when they move a budget resolution. The minority can't filibuster the budget resolution itself, but they can offer an unlimited number of amendments. And it's a process that means they go, all through the night, as many amendments as they want to offer. And it only stops when the senators' need for sleep exceeds their desire to make the majority cast difficult political vote defending their product or their resolution. So that's what they finished up on Saturday morning. A few things stand out about what they passed on the Senate floor yesterday morning. First, the Senate now seems to be on board with doing this one big, beautiful bill rather than two separate steps in the process to do a spending bill first and then a tax bill later. The House leaders had feared that two-step process would leave taxes unaddressed until late in the year or possibly not at all, depending on how things played out with the other priorities that would come first. Second, the Senate also agreed to use the single bill to raise the debt limit. This is something that they had been resisting in the Senate, but that President Trump has said he really wants to do in a partisan package so they don't have to worry about negotiating with Democrats and giving concessions to Democrats. It was moved outside of reconciliation. And then third, the instructions to the Senate Finance Committee, which has jurisdiction over the tax component of the package, is really interesting. Most notably, they're attempting to use a current policy baseline, which will make it appear free to extend those pieces of TCJA that are expiring this year. That's over $3.5 trillion of tax cuts that won't need to be offset using a JCT score from last year. And then that score actually is over $4 trillion based on an updated estimate that we saw this past week. And the number could climb if Senate Budget Committee Chairman Lindsey Graham decides that other expiring items like CFC look-through, the Work Opportunity Tax Credit, and New Markets Tax Credit are also considered to be part of that current policy baseline. And then there's a question of whether they could try to take it a step further and even claim budgetary savings by letting some things like the ACA premium credit expire as scheduled under this new current policy baseline theory. On top of that, Finance authorized an increase in the deficit by another $1.5 trillion. So that is a net number for tax cut that could grow to well over $3 trillion if paired with spending cuts or some other base broadeners like seesaw or the excise tax on stock buybacks that we've been talking about for months. So the total gross tax cut number that the Senate is aiming at could approach $7 trillion or even more on a traditional scoring basis. And that's substantially higher than the cap the House has imposed on itself. And finally, the last thing I'll note, and perhaps a sign of things to come, there were two Republicans who voted against passage, Susan Collins of Maine and Rand Paul of Kentucky. And what's interesting here is they're arguably kind of the ideological ends of the Senate Republican conference, suggesting what a difficult balancing act we have here. And we're going to continue to see for Republican leaders as they move through this process.
So I find this whole idea that current tax policy, extending current tax policy is free to be fascinating and such a different, perhaps, focus for the reconciliation process. So does this mean that the Senate parliamentarian has blessed the use of the current policy baseline?
No, it doesn't. The question has been deferred for now, but Leader Thune is taking the position that the budget rules allow the Budget Committee Chairman, Lindsey Graham, to use whatever baseline he chooses. And so it is solely his decision. We're going to see this fight flare up again for sure. Several Republican senators have apparently told Leader Thune they would not vote to overrule the parliamentarian if she subsequently does rule against this method of scorekeeping, as this would be a major step toward repealing the Senate filibuster. And many believe the budget chairman unilaterally making this ruling would be tantamount to a filibuster workaround that would change the way the Senate operates going forward. So I think this is a space we have to watch for sure.
Agreed. So, John, we know Donald Trump has embraced this new framework. So does that mean we expect smooth sailing in the House?
Probably not. There's, first of all, some uncertainty around how the House will even proceed this week. Last week, Speaker Johnson sent members home early because he came to loggerheads with Anna Paulina Luna, a congresswoman from Florida, who had gathered support to make a rules change to allow proxy voting for new mothers and fathers. And Speaker Johnson doesn't like that. He thinks it's unconstitutional to allow members to vote by proxy. And they're sort of at crossroads trying to figure out how to deal with it. President Trump sort of undercut Speaker Johnson last week by saying he thought that her proposal was reasonable, but he would leave it to Speaker Johnson to settle that. They need to come to some resolution just to get the House unstuck, which I think will happen hopefully in the next couple of days. But then you have to get to the substance of the resolution itself. And the early reaction from some key House members has not been promising. First of all, at least two House Ways and Means members have been very critical of the idea of using the current policy baseline that Anna articulated so well a minute ago. Others have bemoaned what they say are insufficient targets for spending cuts in the Senate. The Senate has really nominal targets for cutting spending. Senate Leader Thune defends them by saying that even though the listed target for several committees is just $1 billion compared to a total of well over $1.5 trillion or $2 trillion for House budget resolution, the Senate numbers are meant to be a floor that they can work past and will work past. But Leader Thune's worried that if they set a very high floor and fall a dollar short of those spending cuts, they will lose procedural protection. So he wants to give himself the maximum flexibility against a procedural foot fault, although House members think that's a dodge and a prelude to the Senate not doing the hard work of cutting spending. Thune's explanation satisfied some of the fiscal hawks in the Senate, but the House may be a tougher nut to crack here. In particular, House Budget Committee Chairman said this when the resolution was unveiled, quote, "I can't imagine any world where a deficit hawk in the House would ever walk away from the reconciliation process with a deficit going up at the rate it would with that framework." Now, do I think he'll have to walk that statement back? I do, but it's going to be difficult. And there's other House members who've made similarly Sherman-esque-like statements that will be hard for them to walk back from, although we know the best salesman around in terms of getting members of the House to vote for policies he wants is the president. He will have to engage heavily this week to get this across the finish line. But his track record so far in 2025 is unblemished. He has yet to lose a vote in the House, and I think he'll work really hard to get this across the finish line.
So if the House can pass the budget this week, then it's off to the races and we're on track to get the bill to the president?
Well, yes, but it's going to be a tough slog. There are so many difficult barriers to overcome. And let me mention some of the biggest. First of all, the SALT cap remains a vexing problem for leaders. A proposal was floated on Friday of last week to raise the $10,000 cap to $25,000. And we saw several members from SALT states like California and New York say that's not good enough. Well, every dollar you spend on SALT, you're not spending anything else. That's a real problem, real challenge for leaders. How much savings can they get from the Medicaid program before moderates begin to balk? How much of what Donald Trump campaigned on taxes, like no tax on tips or overtime, or a lower rate for domestic manufacturing, will he insist on, and how Congress draft those things, which are in many ways, and in many cases, sort of new or novel ideas. As Anna alluded to, what base broadeners might be used to expand the gross amount of tax cuts that fit into a package? Sea salt, as Anna mentioned, is very much under discussion. I've always thought the stock buyback excess tax would be considered. What else will make the cut? And in particular, How far can they go in trimming the clean energy credits from the Inflation Reduction Act before they trim their own vote count? We know there's been some resistance from some members to going too far on the IRA. Is this the year that Kerry just finally taxes capital gains? It's been discussed for years and years and years. There seems to be a little bit more momentum around it this year than ever before, but there are many strong champions of keeping current law as is in the Congress. Where do they fall out on this? Next, as Anna noted, what happens if the parliamentarian gives a thumbs down verdict to the use of the current policy baseline? And sort of somewhat relatedly, as we've talked about on the prior podcast, Kerry, every provision in a reconciliation bill must have a direct impact on revenues or spending. If you adopt a current policy baseline, you don't survive the burden rule unless every similar provision is modified to have a measurable impact on spending or revenue. So what does the bill look like when it gets through the surgery of adding or raising rates or lowering rates or making changes to ensure it has some score on the deficit? And maybe most importantly, does the net total, no matter how you count it, whether current policy or current law, add more to the deficit than fiscal hawks in the House can accept? So, yeah, assuming the House can pass the budget, we're closer than ever to starting line for actual tax legislation passing, but there's still a huge number of very difficult challenges facing lawmakers.
What I'm hearing is that the two chambers might produce very different tax bills. So how will leaders get them all onto the same page?
Yeah, for all the reasons John just outlined, this is going to be really hard. The Senate instructions create the prospect of a much larger tax bill, whether scored on current law basis or looking at the number of things that you can squeeze into it in the House. And the House instructions on their face are significantly more ambitious on spending cuts. We understand the House might be concerned that if it plays out this way, where you have the House proceeding with a package that adheres to more stringent budgetary constraint, President Trump could end up preferring a bigger, more robust Senate package of tax cuts and try to squeeze the House to concur on that. And I'm really not sure how the House can prevent that outcome, but they're hoping the more of this they can draft in concert with the Senate on both the taxing and the spending side, then the less daylight there's going to be between the two chambers and between the two approaches.
So, John, do we think this could wrap up by Memorial Day, as Speaker Johnson has said he would like it to?
I'm really skeptical of that. As a good friend of mine said, I wish I could take credit for his quote, the great thing about setting deadlines, if you don't do that, you can't enjoy the whooshing sound of rushing past them. Given all the challenges that Anne and I have laid out, I would find it very hard to imagine them getting to a closure on a reconciliation package by the end of next month. Now, I do think we'll probably see proposals begin to unfold from the various committees beginning early to the middle of next month. But it'll take some time to hammer out the differences that we expect between the two chambers' approaches before they get them to the president's desk. The deadline I'm really watching for is the debt limit. Because Republicans have now decided they want to add debt limit to this, whatever the deadline is that we find when the U.S. will breach the debt limit becomes the default deadline for passing this reconciliation bill. We think that's going to happen sometime mid to late summer. And as we get closer to that date, we'll get more specificity around when the so-called X date is, on when we would no longer be able to finance our national debt. That, to me, is the real benchmark to watch for when they have to produce bills that get to the president's signature.
All right. Well, we will pay attention to that. And for sure, we will be back to talk about all of that and more as these developments continue. Thank you, as always, Anna and John, for your time. Thank you, audience, for listening. I hope you join us next time. In the meantime, if you'd like more information, you can go to Deloitte.com and sign up for the Tax News and Views newsletter, which comes out weekly. And beyond that, I hope you tune in here for our next session. Be well, everyone. Take care.